A lot of my students seem to believe that British people never say what we mean, that we're never direct, and that we avoid being direct at all costs. But is that really true? Well, today in this lesson, we're going to go beyond the stereotype because British people do get direct. And when they do, it is not random, it follows clear cultural rules. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about when and why we may get direct. We're going to look at 5 key situations where British people become unmistakably direct. And we're going to talk about why. Hello, you wonderful people. Welcome to English Right Now. My name is Roy, your British English teacher. Now, I've been a teacher of English for nearly 15 years. And over that time, I've helped thousands of students from across the world, just like you, learning things like British English, a modern British RP accent, and of course, British culture. And I often say that language is more than just words, it is a culture. And if you want to learn even more about being direct, there's a free PDF that you can download in the description below. But now let's talk about when British people are direct. But of course, before we talk about when British people do get direct, let's talk about why we are often indirect. British people will often go to great lengths to avoid being too direct or being too blunt, especially with people that we're not really familiar with. That's a key point. Even when we feel very strongly about something or we completely disagree. And this is also where the politeness theory comes in. Now, the politeness theory is a theory that was proposed by Brown and Levinson. And in the politeness theory, they explain that every culture has some sort of face. And face refers to our social self-image. Now, in the theory, they talk about the positive face, negative face, and also talk about some key strategies to avoid threatening people's self-image, people's face. Now, in the UK, negative face is especially strong. This is the desire to be kind of left alone and left kind of independent and not being imposed upon. So if you think in the UK, British people like to not feel pressured or imposed upon. So when we speak, we often use politeness strategies to avoid threatening somebody's negative face. And a lot of that strategy revolves around using indirect forms of communication. Effectively, we use indirect forms of communication to avoid offending somebody. So instead of saying, shut that window, a British person might say, oh, would you mind if I just close that a bit? It's not about being false, it's about softening the message. It's comfortable and it avoids any kind of tension or friction. Shut that window is very direct and it's kind of a command. But if I ask, would you mind if I close that window just a bit? It's a lot more indirect, but it is the same message. Now, if you come from a culture where directness is a sign of honesty or confidence, British indirectness can seem a bit confusing or at times even a bit passive aggressive. But once you understand the why, the reason behind it, you start to see it for what it is. It's a form of respect. Being indirect is a way of saying, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't want to pressure you. I want to keep this conversation safe. I value our harmony more than getting what I want immediately. So in some ways, being indirect is about maintaining social balance. But in this lesson, we're not talking about being indirect. We're talking about being direct. So all of that, when does that go out of the window? All of that being indirect? Well, there are certain situations, but if you see being indirect as a way of testing the social waters, that a British person in a situation or with a person that we're not quite familiar with, we will probably resort to indirect forms of communication. So being indirect is often linked with the unpredictable or the unfamiliar. It's a kind of protection for both me and for you, but possibly more a social protection for me, because if I impose upon you, I'm being rude and we both lose face. But again, I'm the one being rude. So it's a kind of social protection strategy. And this also bleeds into other indirect techniques like small talk. We don't get too heavy, too fast. But being direct rather than indirect is very much related to the situation. Certain situations can be linked to being direct. We're going to talk about 5 of those, but it can also be about being familiar, knowing that I won't offend the person who's listening, knowing that what I say, if I am direct, you will understand as a form of honest communication. So, in other words, if I know you're not going to be offended by me being direct, I can become direct. So, directness in British culture relies very heavily on trust that we both know what's happening, understanding, and that kind of connection. So, when we know that you're comfortable and we're comfortable with each other, we can be more direct. And we also know what chats we can have that won't go too far. So, I know your limits and you know mine. So we could simply put it that being indirect is about the unfamiliar, whereas being direct is about the familiar, or in certain situations where we are sort of almost given permission to drop indirectness. Now, I'm going to very quickly talk about a personal experience. Many, many years ago, I went away with a friend called Simon. We went to the US. Now, in America, they obviously speak English as well, so language wasn't really a problem. However, we were often asked a question about our friendship. People often said, "Do you actually like each other?" And we would always say, "Of course, why?" Now, the simple truth is, because we were so close, we felt comfortable to be very direct, and often we used humor and sarcasm and certain jokes that, for us, was a kind of demonstration of the solidarity of our friendship. But for some people on the outside, it appeared like we didn't like each other, and that kind of gives you an idea of what directness is all about. It's that demonstration that we are on the same level. We understand each other in certain cases. Now, there are also things about the certain situations as well that we're going to talk about, but is it better to be direct or indirect? It totally depends on the situations. But now let's talk about 5 situations where being direct is pretty normal, and I'm going to show you that it is not random. Number 1, when the social script allows it. So the first and most consistent context for being direct in Britain is when there's a clear social script. Let's talk about, first of all, the workplace. A British manager might say, "We need this finished by Friday," or "You will need to revise this section." It is not rude, it's about efficiency. The context of being in the workplace permits directness because clarity is valued in task-based situations or settings. The last thing your manager wants you to do is to completely misunderstand and do the wrong thing. So when your manager speaks to you, it's quite common for them to be quite direct. Again, it's not rude, it is situation specific. Likewise, in customer service. So if something is not possible, it's quite natural to say, "I'm afraid that's not possible." "I'm really sorry, I'm afraid that's not possible." Again, you put some kind words at the start, you are apologizing, "I'm afraid that's not possible, I'm really sorry," but the message is very, very clear. And likewise, in legal or academic writing, it is important to be direct. Rather than saying, "Oh, I'm not sure if that's quite right," in legal or academic writing, you would say, "The evidence contradicts this claim." So, British people are more direct when the situation demands clarity and the roles are clearly defined. Now, I will also mention, as a kind of side note, when dealing with tourists or people who have a lower level of English, British people will often become more direct. Now, I will say this is more of a last resort. So they'll try, first of all, to speak in a quite natural, indirect way, so they don't want to offend you. But if the message doesn't land, they will resort to directness for clarity's sake. However, this isn't always comfortable for a British person. Now, it isn't rude to speak directly, it's efficient. But some British people won't feel comfortable with being that direct with somebody they don't know. So they'll put a kind of barrier up, or they'll withdraw slightly from the situation. The second situation where British people may become more direct is when time or safety is important. So if you've ever been in an emergency drill or a safety announcement in the UK, if you've ever heard one of those, you're not going to hear something indirect. You won't hear, "Excuse me, but if you wouldn't mind just making your way this way," you're going to hear something like, "Leave the building immediately. Do not enter this area." This is because safety is more important than being indirect. So when time, safety, or rules are involved, British culture allows and sometimes expects indirect speech. Famously, if you go to London and you catch the Underground has moments of stark clarity. Mind the gap. There is no indirect speech there. And the simple rule is directness becomes acceptable, even necessary, when the consequences are high. So the basic idea is that the threat to face, the threat to social image, is kind of overridden when there is a threat to physical safety. So clarity takes priority. The third situation in which you may hear British people get more direct is when something has gone too far. Now, there is a tipping point in British culture. There is a moment that snaps. It's kind of when politeness just finishes. You see it most clearly when somebody breaks an unspoken rule. Now, in British culture, we love queuing. We love to stand in these queues. We even have that wonderful word. In American English, they tend to use the word line, but we have this wonderful word queue. To queue, a verb, and queue, a noun. We love it. In fact, I often think that if a queue starts, British people will join it without knowing what's at the start of the queue. They will just join the queue. If somebody jumps the queue, they ignore that the queue is there and they move in front of you without standing in the line. You may hear a British person say, "Excuse me, there's a queue." It's not aggressive. It's not about starting a fight. It's simply about a kind of clinical approach to saying, "Excuse me, there's a queue." It kind of gives the benefit of the doubt that the person may not have realized. They may have innocently entered the queue where they thought the back of the queue was. So there's that. But when you listen to a British person explaining that the social rules have been broken or the unspoken rules have been broken, the tone changes. It becomes quite cool, quite firm, and it becomes very unmistakable. Instead of, "Oh, excuse me, sorry, there's a queue," we go, "Oh, excuse me, there's a queue." It's not aggressive, but it is clear. So when somebody breaks social norms, directness kind of becomes a form of social correction. It's a way of restoring order without confrontation, but it's with precision. And do remember, there is a free PDF that you can download in the link below. So now let's move on to situation 4, where British people might get a bit more direct. And this one is where it starts to get a bit more psychological. So when British people speak to children or those in a lower status role, for example, in a company, directness often returns. Let's talk about children first. If a child asks for something and you want to say no, we usually just say no. No. We don't bother saying, "I'm really sorry, darling. I'm afraid not this time." Some people do kind of negotiate a little bit with their children, but quite commonly, you will hear somebody say, "No, not this time." Or, "Put that down. Put that down." I'm reliving a memory here. Or, "You need to apologize. You need to say sorry." Why? There's less of a risk to face. The power dynamics allow for clarity. It's not rude. It's again about clarity. And also, let's talk about the workplace. If a sort of senior and junior member of staff are talking, the junior member of staff may hear something like, "Look, that won't work. You need to try again." Or, "This part needs rewriting." You may hear an occasional sorry or something like that. But if the person is even more senior, for example, management or senior management, directness is even more expected. It's not about being cold. It's again about efficiency. And it can be quite helpful because it avoids ambiguity. My child isn't confused if I say no or "Put that down, not this time." A junior member of staff wouldn't be confused if I said, "I'm sorry, that won't work. You'll need to rewrite that." There's no ambiguity and it's accepted and expected. Think of it this way: directness flows downwards more easily than upwards in British hierarchy. So think of it this way: face-threatening acts are more acceptable when the speaker has social authority. However, when we're in coffee shops or supermarkets or somewhere where a person is doing a service for you and they have to do that service, British people may be slightly efficient, but they are always incredibly polite. "Oh, can I have a latte, please? Can I have a cappuccino, please?" And some people will become indirect even when that person has to do something. "Oh, would you mind just checking this for me?" Why? Well, it is a mark of respect. Now, I know realistically in a coffee shop, if I ask for a latte, that person's not going to say no unless that's unavailable. They're going to say, of course. So being polite, it's not about being fake, yet again. Being polite is merely about showing respect for the other person. Always use please and thank you when somebody is doing something for you. But finally, let's talk about the fifth situation in which British people may get more direct. And it's when you're in the inner circle. What do I mean? Well, here's something pretty surprising. British people can be very direct with those that they trust the most. Among friends or families, the rules relax. Close friends, family, the rules are just gone. So you can say things like, you look exhausted, or mate, that was a bit of a silly decision, to be honest, or come on, you're overthinking it. Just do it. This directness is not rudeness, it's intimacy. It signals that we are close enough that I don't need to sugarcoat this. I don't need to dance the politeness dance. That I trust you, you trust me, we have that closeness. I can tell you when you make a mistake and we can laugh about it. And you might even hear brutal honesty wrapped in humor. So if somebody's wearing a shirt that is pretty bad, I might say, mate, what is that? You look like an out-of-work magician in that shirt. So I'm saying I don't like your shirt, but I'm also making a joke. Or if somebody's had a haircut, I might say something sarcastic. Even if I think your hair is pretty cool, I might say, what happened to your hair? Did you sue the barber? So directness becomes a sign of closeness and trust. It's a signal that you're in, but don't use it too early. Otherwise, a British person may create barriers. But that teasing, that bluntness and the mockery among friends are often signs of a deep affection, deep trust in British culture. You only have to look at the banter between me and my friend, that kind of series of jokes and teasing, to see how close we were, but also how it can be misunderstood from the outside. So, are British people ever direct? Absolutely. But it is never random. It's always tied to context, hierarchy, safety, emotion, or intimacy. So directness tends to show up when there is a clear social script, when there is urgency or safety issues, when norms are broken, think about jumping the queue, when the power dynamics allow for it, or when there is emotional closeness, for example, with trusted friends and family. When you understand these patterns, British English starts to make a lot more sense. Remember that there is a free PDF that you can download in the description below, but thank you very much for watching. Let me know some other questions you have about British English and British culture, but thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.